Tonight, we journey into the darkest corners of Middle-earth's history to trace the tale of one who was once a man but became something far more terrible. This is the story of the Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgul, and the shadow that haunted the hearts of men for over 4,000 years. We'll cover everything about his history, how a man was corrupted, and what terrible deeds followed. So grab your favourite mug, sit or lay down comfortably, and join us in one of the most epic and dark stories in Middle-earth. Chapter 1. The King Who Was Lost to Shadow. In the mists of the Second Age, when the world was younger and the kingdoms of men stretched across vast lands under starlit skies, there lived a king whose name has been lost to time itself. We know not whether he ruled in the great island realm of Numenor, with its white towers gleaming above the western sea, or held dominion over some lesser kingdom of mortal men in Middle-earth proper. What we do know is that he was a man of great power and influence, possessed of the qualities that mark true kings: wisdom in council, strength in battle, and the loyalty of his people. Picture, if you will, the golden halls where he once held court. Perhaps marble pillars reached toward painted ceilings, and tapestries told the stories of his lineage. The king would have worn robes of rich fabric, a crown upon his brow that caught the light of oil lamps and braziers. His voice would have carried the authority of generations, his words shaping the fate of thousands. In those days, he was still himself, still the man who had earned his throne through birthright or valour, still possessed of the warmth that marks mortal hearts. But in the year 1600 of the Second Age, everything changed. It was then that Sauron the Deceiver came to the elven smiths of Eregion in fair form, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. To the world, he presented himself as an emissary of the Valar, come to help the peoples of Middle-earth achieve greatness beyond their wildest dreams. And among his greatest gifts were 19 rings of power, 9 for mortal men doomed to die. How the king came to possess one of these 9, we can only speculate. Perhaps Sauron approached him directly, recognizing in him the qualities that would make him a powerful servant. Or maybe the ring came to him through intermediaries, gift-bearers, who spoke of alliance and mutual benefit between kingdoms. The ring itself would have been beautiful beyond description, wrought of gold that seemed to hold its own inner light, set with a gem that captured and reflected the very essence of power. At first, the ring seemed the greatest blessing imaginable. It enhanced everything that already made him a great king. His wisdom grew deeper, his strength in battle became legendary, and his ability to see into the hearts and minds of men expanded beyond natural limits. Time seemed to slow for him. Where other men aged and died, he remained vital and strong. His kingdom prospered under his enhanced rule, and his people looked upon him with awe and reverence. But the ring exacted its price in ways too subtle to notice at first. Sleep became elusive, and when it came, it brought dreams that were not entirely his own. In the depths of night, he began to sense another presence, distant but growing stronger. Whispers in languages he had never learned began to echo in the corridors of his mind. The warmth he had once felt toward his subjects slowly cooled, replaced by something more calculating, more distant. Years passed, and the changes accelerated. His skin grew pale, as if the very blood beneath it had begun to thin. His eyes, once warm with mortal kindness, took on a cold gleam that made even his most trusted advisers uncomfortable. He began to see his people not as subjects to protect, but as resources to be managed. His court, once filled with laughter and the music of harps, grew quiet and formal. Courtiers learned to speak in whispers, to avoid drawing his direct attention. The king's appetite for food and drink diminished, though his hunger for knowledge and power only grew. He spent long hours alone in his chambers, studying ancient texts that spoke of magics and secrets that mortal men were not meant to know. The crown upon his head seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, though whether this was due to its physical weight or the burden of what he was becoming, none could say. His loved ones, his queen, his children, his closest friends, began to sense that something fundamental had changed. The man they had known was still there, but he was fading, like a reflection in water disturbed by an ever stronger wind. When they looked into his eyes, they saw not the king they remembered, but something alien looking back. His voice, when he spoke, carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it. By the year 1700 of the Second Age, The transformation was nearly complete. The king who had once walked in sunlight and delighted in the simple pleasures of mortal life now found the daylight harsh and unwelcome. He began to appear only at dusk and in the dark hours before dawn, wrapped in cloaks that seemed to drink in the light around them. His form, once solid and reassuring, began to seem somehow less substantial, as if he existed only partially in the world of the living. The final stage came when Sauron, his power now sufficient to assert complete control, called his servants to him. The king felt the call like a tide pulling at his very essence. He could no more resist it than a leaf could resist the autumn wind. In the darkness of a moonless night, he walked from his palace for the last time, leaving behind everything he had once been, his name, his kingdom, his humanity itself. What remained was no longer a king of men, but something else entirely. The first and greatest of the nine, he who would come to be known as the Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar, the chief servant of the Dark Lord. His transformation was complete, and with it began a reign of terror that would span millennia. The man he had been was gone forever, consumed by the very power he had sought to wield. In seeking to transcend the limitations of mortality, he had instead become something far less than human, a wraith bound to the will of another, a shadow cast by a darkness not his own. And yet, in losing everything that made him a man, he had gained a terrible immortality and power beyond the dreams of mortal kings. This was the price of the 9 rings, and he had paid it in full. Chapter 2. Lord of the Nine and Servant of the Dark. The halls of Barad-dûr echoed with footsteps that made no sound as the 9 gathered before their master. No longer were they the kings and sorcerers they had once been. Now they stood as wraiths, their forms wrapped in robes and mail that served more to give them shape in the world of the living than to protect bodies they no longer possessed. At their head stood the one who had been first to fall, first to surrender completely to the power of the rings, and who now bore the terrible honour of being their lord. The Witch King of Angmar, though that title lay yet in the future, had become something unprecedented in the history of Arda. He was Sauron's voice when the Dark Lord chose not to speak directly, his hand when more subtle work was required than the mouth of Sauron could provide. Among the 9, he alone could stand in his master's presence without being utterly overwhelmed by the dark majesty that emanated from the Lord of Mordor. In those days of the Second Age, when Sauron's power waxed great and his armies marched openly under the banner of the Lidless Eye, the Nazgul served as his most trusted servants. They were commanders of his hosts, governors of his conquered territories, and the instruments of his will in lands where subtlety was required over brute force. The chief of the 9 oversaw it all, coordinating the efforts of his 8 companions with a mind that had been sharpened by centuries of service to Sauron's will. Picture the great war councils held in the depths of Barad-dûr, where strategy was planned for the conquest of all Middle-earth. The Nazgul would stand in a circle around maps carved from black stone, their invisible faces turned toward representations of Gil-galad's realm in Lindon, toward the growing power of Númenor across the sea, toward the scattered kingdoms of men who still resisted the dark tide. Their lord would trace routes of invasion with fingers that cast no shadow, speak of weaknesses in enemy defences with a voice that carried the accumulated wisdom of ages. The Witch King's role in these councils was paramount. While his 8 companions were mighty in their own right, he alone possessed the depth of strategic understanding that came from having ruled in his own right before his fall. He understood the hearts of mortal men in ways that pure evil could not, for he remembered what it was to hope, to fear, to love, even if those memories now served only to help him manipulate others. During the War of the Elves and Sauron, which raged from 1693 to 1700 of the Second Age, the 9 rode forth as a unified force for the first time. Their terror preceded them like a chill wind, and mortal men who faced them in battle found their courage failing before the first blow was struck. The very sight of the 9 mounted upon their fell steeds was enough to break the will of entire armies. At their head rode their lord, his presence on the battlefield serving as a dark beacon that drew all shadows to him. Yet for all their power, the 9 were ultimately servants, and their fate was bound to that of their master. When Gil-galad and Elendil formed the last alliance of elves and men, the tide of war began to turn against Mordor. The Witch King found himself for the first time facing defeat. Not through any failure of his own, but because the fundamental balance of power in Middle-earth was shifting against the darkness. The siege of Barad-dûr lasted 7 years, and throughout that time the 9 remained at their master's side. They led sorties against the besieging armies, brought reports from the field, and served as Sauron's eyes and ears beyond the walls of his fortress. But as the siege wore on, something unprecedented began to happen to them. Their forms, which had grown more solid and terrible over the centuries of their service, began to fade. The rings that bound them to Sauron also bound them to his strength, and as his power waned under the pressure of the Alliance, so too did theirs. The Witch King felt it first, a growing transparency, a sense that he was becoming less present in the world with each passing day. His voice, which had once commanded armies, became little more than a whisper. His very existence began to feel tenuous, like a candle flame guttering in a strong wind. When Isildur cut the one ring from Sauron's hand, the effect on the 9 was immediate and catastrophic. The Witch King felt the connection to his master snap like a broken chain, and with it went everything that had anchored him to physical existence. In an instant, he and his 8 companions were reduced to shadows of shadows, barely able to maintain any presence in the world at all. The centuries that followed were a time of exile and diminishment, unlike anything they had experienced since their initial transformation. Without Sauron's will to give them purpose and his power to give them form, the 9 wandered as formless spirits, unable to affect the world around them in any meaningful way. They were trapped between life and death, unable to find rest but equally unable to act. The Witch King's memories of this time, if they could be called memories, were fragments of cold and emptiness. Sometimes he found himself in places that had once known his presence, ancient battlefields where his terror had once broken enemy lines, ruins of cities that had fallen to his strategic genius. But he could no more touch these places than a dream could touch the waking world. He was a phantom of his former power, a whisper of the darkness that had once commanded armies. For long ages the 9 drifted in this state of diminished existence. The world changed around them. Kingdoms rose and fell. New races grew to prominence. The very face of Middle-earth was reshaped by time and the works of its inhabitants. But the 9 remained constant in their diminishment, waiting without hope for their master's return. It was said by some that during these dark years, when their forms were too weak to be seen by mortal eyes, the Nazgul learned things about the nature of death and unlife that even Sauron did not fully understand. They discovered paths between the world of the living and the world of the dead, passages through shadow that would serve them well in the ages to come. The Witch King, as their leader, delved deepest into these mysteries, becoming something more, and less, than even Sauron had intended when he first offered the rings to mortal men. When at last their master began to stir again in the depths of Mirkwood, the 9 felt his awakening like a sunrise after endless night. Slowly, gradually, they began to regain substance and purpose, but they were no longer quite what they had been. The long years of exile had changed them, refined them into something purer and more terrible. When they finally walked the world again, it would be with a power tempered by ages of suffering and a hunger sharpened by centuries of want. The Second Age was ending, and with it, the first great chapter of their service to the Dark Lord. What lay ahead would test them in ways they could not yet imagine, and would see their lord rise to heights of terror that would make his previous achievements seem pale by comparison. Chapter 3: The Witch King of Angmar. The year 1300 of the Third Age marked a turning point in the history of Middle-earth, though few at the time recognised it for what it was. In the great libraries of Rivendell, the scribes noted increased orc activity in the Misty Mountains. In Minas Tirith, watchmen reported strange movements in the shadows beyond Ithilien. And in the north, where the kingdom of Arnor had split into 3 smaller realms, there came whispers of a darkness gathering in the empty lands beyond the Ettenmoors. It was there, in the cold wastes of Angmar, that the Lord of the Nazgul emerged from centuries of diminished existence to claim a new domain and a new title. No longer merely the chief of Sauron's servants, he would become something more immediate and terrible, a power in his own right, ruling his own realm and commanding his own armies. He would become the Witch King of Angmar, and the very name would become a curse upon the lips of men. The choice of Angmar was not made lightly. The region lay between the kingdoms of Arthedain and Rudor, positioned like a dagger pointed at the heart of what remained of Arnor's power. It was a land of iron hills and bitter winds, where the bones of the earth lay close to the surface, and the very air seemed to carry whispers of ancient malice. Here, in the shadow of Mount Graham and the peaks of the misty mountains, the Witch King found terrain that matched his nature. His first task was to gather servants worthy of his new kingdom. The orcs of the mountains came first, drawn by a power they could not name, but dared not resist. They descended from their caves and hidden fortresses to kneel before the dark throne that seemed to appear overnight in the heart of Angmar. Trolls followed, and after them came men, not the free men of the Dunedain, but darker folk from the edges of the world, hillmen and wild clans who had never known the light of Numenor's legacy. But the Witch King's greatest servants were not orcs or men, but spirits called from the darkness by his own enhanced power. Wraiths and phantoms, creatures of shadow and malice, gathered to his banner. Under his rule, Angmar became a nexus of necromantic power, a place where the boundary between life and death grew thin and permeable. His very presence changed the nature of the land itself, turning streams cold and bitter, withering the few hardy plants that had grown in that harsh soil, and filling the air with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down upon all living things. The establishment of his fortress was a work of dark artistry. Using knowledge gained during his long exile, the Witch King shaped Kharndum not merely as a military stronghold, but as a focus for his power. The black stones of its walls were arranged in patterns that channeled and amplified necromantic energies. Its towers reached toward the sky like grasping fingers, and from their heights, the Witch King could see far across the northern lands, his enhanced sight piercing mists and shadows that would blind mortal eyes. From this stronghold, he began his campaign against the remnants of Arna, with the patience of one who had learned to think in centuries rather than years. His strategy was not merely military but psychological. He sought not just to conquer the northern kingdoms, but to break the spirit of their people, to fill them with such dread that they would flee rather than fight, despair rather than hope. The first phase of his campaign targeted Rudor, the weakest and most divided of the three successor kingdoms of Arnor. By 1356, through a combination of military pressure, political manipulation, and pure terror, he had placed a puppet king on its throne. The transformation of Rudar from a free kingdom to a vassal state of Angmar was accomplished so gradually that many of its people did not realize what had happened until it was far too late to resist. With Rudor under his control, the Witch King turned his attention to Cardolan and Arthedain. Here he faced stiffer resistance, for these kingdoms retained more of the strength and wisdom of their Númenórean heritage. But the Witch King had advantages that no mortal enemy could match. His armies felt no fear, knew no fatigue, and could be replenished from the endless spawning pits of the misty mountains. Moreover, his very presence on the battlefield was enough to drain the courage from all but the strongest hearts. The wars that followed were characterized by a grinding, relentless pressure that slowly wore down the defenders. The Witch King did not seek quick victories, but rather the slow erosion of his enemy's will to fight. He would appear without warning at the head of his host, strike swiftly at a border fortress or an outlying settlement, and then withdraw before a proper defense could be mounted. His tactics were those of a wolf pack, constant harassment, wearing down the prey until it could no longer flee or fight effectively. What made him truly terrifying was his understanding of mortal nature. Having once been a man himself, he knew exactly how to maximize fear and despair. His armies carried banners that seemed to move with a life of their own, designs that hurt the eyes to look upon and filled the mind with visions of death and defeat. The very horns they sounded in battle were tuned to frequencies that resonated with primal fears buried deep in the human psyche. More personally devastating was his use of psychological warfare. The Witch King would appear in the dreams of enemy commanders, speaking words that carried the weight of prophecy and doom. He would send messages to besieged cities not in writing, but as whispers on the wind, voices that spoke of the futility of resistance and the certainty of defeat. Children would wake screaming from nightmares of a tall figure in crown and robes, and soldiers would desert their posts after seeing visions of their own deaths. By 1409, his patience was rewarded with his greatest victory. The coordinated assault he launched that year saw the fall of Fornost, the capital of Arthedain, and the scattering of its royal house. The destruction was so complete that it seemed the kingdom of Arnor had finally come to its end. The palantir of Anúminas was lost, the royal lines scattered to the winds, and the great works of the Dunedain lay in ruins. But the Witch King's triumph was not to last. In 1974, an alliance of unlikely allies assembled to challenge his dominion. Elrond led forces from Rivendell, while from the Grey Havens came the power of Círdan the shipwright. Most significantly, Glorfindel arrived with additional reinforcements, his very presence a blazing light against the darkness of Angmar. The Battle of Fornost in 1975 marked the end of the Witch King's northern kingdom. Against the combined might of the alliance, even his enhanced power was insufficient. The prophecy that would later echo at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields was first spoken here by Glorfindel, that no living man would kill the Lord of the Nazgul. It was a pronouncement that seemed to acknowledge the Witch King's power even as his kingdom fell around him. Faced with defeat, the Witch King made a strategic withdrawal that demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had served him throughout the centuries. Rather than make a hopeless last stand, he abandoned Angmar and vanished into the shadows, taking with him the most loyal of his servants and the accumulated knowledge of his years as a ruler in his own right. The destruction of his kingdom was a setback, but it was not the end of his story. The Witch King had learned valuable lessons about ruling through fear, about the power of patient strategy, and about the weaknesses inherent in the kingdoms of men. When he next appeared in the Chronicles of Middle-earth, it would be with new purposes and even greater power, ready to serve his master in ways that his experience as the Lord of Angmar had uniquely prepared him for. The northern kingdoms would never fully recover from his onslaught. Even after Arnor was nominally restored under the returned king, the shadow of Angmar's terror lingered in the memory of the people. The Witch King's reign had taught an entire generation that evil could triumph, that kingdoms could fall, and that even the legacy of Numenor was not proof against the patient malice of the darkness. These lessons would serve him well in the trials yet to come. Chapter 4. The Shadow over Minas Morgul. The great city had once been a jewel of Gondor, its white towers catching the first light of dawn as they rose from the Pass of Ithilien. Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Rising Moon, had stood as a guardian against the darkness of Mordor, its walls blessed by the hands of Númenorian builders, and its halls filled with the wisdom of the Dunedain. But by the year 2002 of the Third Age, all that nobility had been transformed into something unspeakably corrupt. When the Witch King claimed Minas Ithil for his own, he performed perhaps the most terrible feat of his long existence, the complete perversion of everything the city had once represented. Where Minas Ithil had been a beacon of hope, Minas Morgul became a source of dread that could be felt for leagues around. Where the original city had celebrated the beauty of moonlight and starlight, the corrupted tower now emanated a sickly phosphorescence that made the very darkness seem preferable to its tainted illumination. The transformation was not merely architectural, but metaphysical. The Witch King brought to bear all the necromantic knowledge he had accumulated during his long existence, weaving spells that reached down to the very foundations of the city and up to the highest pinnacles of its towers. The white stone that had once reflected the pure light of moon and stars now gave off a corpse-like radiance that hurt the eyes to look upon and filled the mind with visions of decay and death. From the highest tower of Minas Morgul, the Witch King established his seat of power in the Western Lands. Unlike his crude fortress of Carn Dûm in Angmar, this was a stronghold worthy of the Lord of the Nazgul, a place where the accumulated malice of millennia could be focused and directed with surgical precision. The very architecture became an extension of his will, with chambers designed to amplify his voice until it could reach across vast distances, and laboratories where he could practice the dark arts that had become second nature to him. But it was not merely as a fortress that Minas Morgul served the Witch King's purposes. The city became the focal point for a campaign of terror that was far more subtle and pervasive than his brutal conquest of the northern kingdoms. Where in Angmar he had wielded armies like a crude bludgeon, here he learned to use fear itself as a weapon of incredible precision and effectiveness. The corruption spread outward from Minas Morgul like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The very air around the city became tainted, carrying whispers and half-heard voices that spoke of despair and defeat. Plants withered when exposed to the winds that blew from the Morgul Vale, and animals fled rather than approach the cursed region. Even hardened soldiers of Gondor would report strange dreams and waking visions after coming too close to the fallen city. From his tower, the Witch King could project his presence across vast distances without ever leaving his stronghold. His voice would whisper in the council chambers of Minas Tirith, speaking words of doubt and discord that sowed division among Gondor's leaders. He would appear in the dreams of the realm's military commanders, showing them visions of defeat so vivid and terrible that many awakened already half convinced of the futility of resistance. The Palantir of Minas Ithil, captured when the city fell, became an even more potent tool in his hands. Through the Seeing Stone, the Witch King could observe events throughout Gondor and beyond, gathering intelligence that no network of spies could match. But more than that, he learned to use the stone as a weapon, projecting his malice through the network of Palantiri to influence and corrupt those who dared to look into the other stones. Perhaps most insidiously, the Witch King began to understand and exploit the deep connections between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. Minas Morgul became a place where these boundaries grew thin, where the ghosts of those who had died in its shadow could be called forth to serve the darkness. The city's crypts and burial chambers, once places of honoured rest for Gondor's defenders, became recruiting grounds for an army of the damned. The effect on Gondor's morale was devastating and cumulative. Where once the sight of Minas Ithil had filled the hearts of the realm's defenders with confidence and resolve, now the mere mention of Minas Morgul was enough to send a chill through even the bravest souls. The city had become a wound in the very fabric of the kingdom, a constant reminder that even the greatest works of the Dunedain could be corrupted and turned against them. Trade routes that had once passed safely through Ithilien were abandoned as merchants reported encounters with spectral figures and unnatural phenomena. The rich farmlands of the region slowly reverted to wilderness, as families fled rather than risk exposure to the malign influence that flowed from the Morgul Vale. What had once been one of Gondor's most prosperous provinces became a haunted wasteland where only the desperate or the foolhardy dared to travel. The Witch King's mastery of psychological warfare reached new heights during his centuries of rule in Minas Morgul. He understood that victory in war was as much about breaking the enemy's will to fight as it was about destroying their armies. Through careful manipulation of rumour and fear, he could make a single company of his Morgul orcs seem like an entire army in the minds of those who faced them. His influence extended far beyond the borders of his domain. In Rohan, riders would speak in hushed tones of the black breath that flowed from the east, a malaise that could strike down strong men without warning and leave them gasping for air that seemed too thin to sustain life. In Lorien, even the protected realm of Galadriel felt the distant touch of his malice, a shadow at the edge of perception that reminded all who dwelt there that darkness was growing in the world. The corrupted city became a symbol of despair that affected not just Gondor, but all the free peoples of Middle-earth. It stood as proof that no defence was perfect, no stronghold impregnable, and no light too bright to be extinguished. The psychological impact of this symbol was perhaps more damaging to the cause of the free peoples than any army the Witch King could have fielded. Yet for all the terror he inspired, the Witch King was never content to simply rule his domain in isolation. Minas Morgul served as the staging ground for countless raids and incursions into Gondor's territory, each one carefully calculated to maximize fear while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that might unite the realm's scattered forces against him. He had learned patience during his long existence, and he was content to slowly strangle Gondor's will to resist rather than risk everything on a single decisive battle. As the centuries passed and the War of the Ring approached, Minas Morgul had become more than just a fortress or even a symbol of corruption. It had become an extension of the Witch King himself, a physical manifestation of his will and power that could influence events across vast distances. From its cursed halls, he prepared for the final confrontation that would determine the fate of Middle-earth, gathering his strength and planning the strategies that would bring either ultimate victory or final defeat. The city that had once been a guardian of the light had become the very antithesis of everything it had originally represented, and in that transformation lay perhaps the clearest expression of the Witch King's terrible genius for corruption and despair. Chapter 5, The Hunt for the Ring and Final Darkness. The autumn of 3018 marked the beginning of the end for the Age of Middle-earth, though the significance of that season would only become clear in hindsight. In the Tower of Minas Morgul, the Witch King received the command that would set in motion the final act of his long existence. The One Ring had been found, and he was to lead the hunt that would either restore his master to ultimate power or bring about the final defeat of the darkness. For the first time in centuries, all 9 of the Nazgul were reunited under their lord's command. They came to Minas Morgul like shadows converging at twilight, the Dwimmerleik from the wastes of Rhun, the Shadow of the East from his dominion beyond the Sea of Rovanion, and 6 others whose names had been lost to time but whose power remained undimmed. Together, they represented the accumulated malice and expertise of nearly 2 ages of service to the Dark Lord. The Witch King's preparation for the hunt demonstrated the methodical brilliance that had made him Sauron's most trusted servant. Intelligence gathered through the Palantir and his network of spies had revealed that the ring was in the possession of a hobbit named Baggins, residing in a place called the Shire in the distant northwest. The very insignificance of the target made the mission more complex, while the 9 could have easily overwhelmed any fortress or army. Locating a single hobbit in a land of which they knew little required subtlety and patience. The journey from Minas Morgul to the Shire took the 9 through lands that had not seen their like for centuries. As they rode forth from the Morgul Vale, their passage left a trail of unnatural dread that lingered long after they had passed. Animals fled their approach, plants withered at their presence, and the very air seemed to grow thick and oppressive in their wake. In Rohan, horses stampeded in panic at the mere scent of their passage, and in Eriador, dogs howled through the night as if sensing some great predator stalking the darkness. At Isengard they paused to consult with Saruman, though the White Wizard's duplicity was already becoming apparent to their enhanced perception. The Witch King's ancient wisdom allowed him to see through Saruman's false assurances, recognizing in the fallen Istar a reflection of his own long-ago corruption. The meeting served to confirm his suspicions about the wizard's true loyalties, while also gathering valuable intelligence about the location and defences of the Shire. The hunt itself became a masterwork of psychological warfare and strategic planning. Rather than simply descending upon the Shire in overwhelming force, the Witch King chose to approach their target through misdirection and terror. He understood that hobbits, for all their hidden strengths, were creatures of comfort and routine, unprepared for the kind of existential dread that the 9 could project. By allowing their presence to be felt gradually, he hoped to flush out his quarry through fear rather than force. The arrival of the 9 in the Shire marked the first time in over a millennium that the peaceful land had been touched by such malevolent power. Their very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the autumn air, turning golden afternoons into times of inexplicable unease, and pleasant evenings into periods of nameless dread. Hobbits found themselves jumping at shadows, starting at unexpected sounds, and feeling a constant sensation of being watched by hostile eyes. But the Witch King had underestimated both the resilience of hobbit kind and the wisdom of his enemies. Gandalf's preparations had already set events in motion that would deny the 9 their easy victory. When they finally traced their quarry to Bag End, they found only an empty hole and a trail that led toward the unknown perils of the Old Forest and the lands beyond. The pursuit that followed tested even the Witch King's accumulated patience and skill. The hobbits proved surprisingly elusive, aided by protections and allies that the Lord of the Nazgul had not anticipated. At Crick Hollow, they found evidence of their quarry but arrived too late to prevent his escape. At the Old Forest's edge they encountered barriers of protection that even their enhanced power could not easily penetrate. Tom Bombadil's domain remained as mysterious and inaccessible to them as it was to all other powers of the world. It was at Weathertop that the Witch King came closest to achieving his master's will through direct action. The ancient watchtower, once a beacon of hope in the days of Arna's power, had become a place where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. Here his power was magnified, and here he finally cornered the ring-bearer who had eluded him for so long. The confrontation atop Weathertop represented the culmination of everything the Witch King had learned about fear, power, and the weakness of mortal will. As he approached the terrified hobbit, crown gleaming with malevolent light and robes billowing with unnatural wind, he must have felt certain that victory was finally within his grasp. The ring was almost close enough to touch, its power calling to him with a voice that promised an end to his millennia of service and the beginning of his own dark dominion. But fate and the courage of unlikely heroes conspired against him once more. The hobbit's unexpected resistance, aided by the power of an ancient blade from the Barrow Downs, inflicted upon him a wound that had not been felt for centuries. More significantly, the arrival of Aragorn with fire drove the 9 back into the shadows, denying them their prize when it had seemed so close to their grasp. The Morgul blade that pierced Frodo's shoulder was more than just a weapon. It was an extension of the Witch King's own corrupted essence, designed to slowly transform its victim into a wraith under his control. Had the Hobbit succumbed completely to its influence, the War of the Ring would have ended before it truly began, with the Ring-bearer himself becoming the Dark Lord's willing servant. The failure of this plan represented not just a tactical setback, but a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of Hobbit resilience and the power of friendship to resist even the deepest corruption. The pursuit continued across the wilds of Eriador, with the Nine pressing their quarry ever closer to the refuge of Rivendell. At the ford of Bruinen, the Witch King made his final desperate attempt to claim the ring before it could pass beyond his reach into the protected realm of Elrond. Leading his 8 companions in a charge across the river, he came closer than ever before to grasping ultimate victory for his master's cause. But here too, the powers that opposed the darkness had prepared well. The flood that swept away the Nazgul's physical forms was more than mere water. It was the wrath of the river itself, commanded by Elrond's power and Gandalf's wisdom. As the waters closed over him, the Witch King felt his carefully maintained physical form dissolving, his consciousness scattered across the rushing torrent like foam upon the waves. The months that followed were a time of reconstruction and growing urgency. Back in Minas Morgul, the Witch King slowly rebuilt his form and gathered his scattered power, while across Middle-earth the forces of light and darkness prepared for the final confrontation. The failure at the ford had been a setback, but it had also revealed valuable information about the ring's location and the strength of its protectors. War was now inevitable, and the Witch King began to prepare for his role in the great battle that would determine the fate of all free peoples. The siege of Minas Tirith represented the culmination of everything the Witch King had learned about warfare, terror, and the breaking of mortal will during his long existence. As the commander of Sauron's western army, he brought to bear not just overwhelming military force, but a deep understanding of how to maximize despair and minimize hope among the defenders. The great battering ram Grond, named for Morgoth's weapon in the Elder Days, served as both a practical siege engine and a symbol of the primordial darkness that had threatened the world since its creation. Under the Witch King's direction, its assault on the great gate of Minas Tirith became a ritual of corruption, each blow accompanied by spells of unbinding that weakened not just the physical barriers, but the spiritual defences that protected the city. When the gates finally broke before Grond's assault, the Witch King entered the Great Gate of Gondor with all the dark majesty that centuries of accumulated power could provide. Here, in the very heart of the kingdom that had resisted his master's will for so long, he stood poised to claim the victory that had eluded him for millennia. The sight of him must have been terrifying beyond description, a figure of shadow and flame crowned with malice and robed in the accumulated dread of ages. It was at this moment of apparent triumph that Gandalf the White confronted him, staff blazing with the light of the Undying Lands, and voice carrying the authority of the Valar themselves. The confrontation between the Lord of the Nazgul and the White Wizard represented more than just a clash between individual powers. It was a meeting between the corrupted wisdom of ages and the pure authority of those who had shaped the world at its creation. For the first time in his long existence, the Witch King found himself facing an opponent whose power seemed to match his own. Gandalf's authority was not diminished by centuries of corruption and service to darkness. If anything, his time in Middle-earth had refined and focused his strength until it blazed like a star in the night. The tension between them was so great that even the stones of the city seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see which power would prove the stronger. But before the confrontation could reach its climax, the horns of Rohan echoed across the Pelennor fields, and the tide of battle shifted once more. The Witch King was forced to abandon his duel with Gandalf to deal with this new threat, mounting his fell beast and taking to the air to coordinate the defence against Theoden's charge. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields became the stage for the Witch King's final performance as the Lord of the Nazgul. From the back of his winged mount, he rained terror upon the forces of Rohan and Gondor, his very presence on the battlefield serving to multiply the effectiveness of Sauron's armies. His aerial attacks were precisely calculated to create maximum psychological impact, striking at command positions to spread confusion, targeting standard-bearers to demoralize entire formations, and using his mount's terrifying cry to break cavalry charges before they could build momentum. The death of King Theoden beneath the Witch King's assault seemed to confirm his victory once more. The old king's charge had been broken, his guards scattered, and Snowmane's fall had left Theoden trapped and helpless beneath his horse. As the Witch King descended for the killing blow, he must have felt the satisfaction of destroying yet another symbol of hope and resistance that had stood against his master's will. But fate had prepared one final surprise for the Lord of the Nazgul. The prophecy that Glorfindel had spoken long ago at the Battle of Fornost, that no living man would destroy him, had shaped the Witch King's understanding of his own invulnerability for over 1,000 years. He had faced armies of men, elven lords and wizards' fire, and had survived them all. The prophecy had become both his protection and his hubris. Dernhelm's revelation as Eowyn of Rohan shattered more than just the Witch King's expectations. It revealed the fundamental limitation of his understanding. For all his accumulated wisdom and strategic brilliance, he had failed to account for the courage of those who loved more than they feared, who were willing to stand against hopeless odds for the sake of others rather than themselves. The ancient blade that pierced his crown had been forged in Westernessa by the Dunedain of old, inscribed with spells specifically designed to harm the undead servants of darkness. Combined with Merry's courage in striking with a barrow blade that carried similar enchantments, Eowyn's sword found the one vulnerability that centuries of dark power had not been able to eliminate completely. As his form began to dissolve for the final time, the Witch King must have experienced something he had not felt since his original transformation, the approach of true death rather than mere diminishment. The crown that had symbolized his power for so long crumbled to dust, his robes fell empty to the blood-soaked earth, and the fell beast that had carried him into battle let out one final cry before it too faded into nothingness. In that moment of dissolution, perhaps some echo of the man he had once been flickered one final time before being extinguished forever. The king who had ruled in distant days, who had worn a different crown and spoken words of wisdom rather than terror, was finally and completely gone. With him died not just a servant of darkness, but the accumulated malice and strategic genius of nearly 4,000 years. The destruction of the Witch King sent ripples of shock through Sauron's entire host. For he had been more than just a commander. He had been the anchor that held their coordination together, the will that had directed their movements with tactical precision. Without his presence to maintain discipline and morale, the army of Mordor began to lose the supernatural coordination that had made it so terrifying. When the One Ring was finally destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom, the remaining 8 Nazgul were swept away like shadows before the dawn. But their lord had already fallen. His long story ended not in the halls of power where he had expected to claim ultimate victory, but on a muddy battlefield where courage had proven stronger than fear and love had overcome the accumulated darkness of ages. Thus ended the tale of the Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgul, who had been many things, a king of men, a servant of darkness, a master of terror, and finally a shadow defeated by the light. His story serves as both a warning about the seductive nature of power and a reminder that even the mightiest servants of evil can be brought low by the courage of those who refuse to despair. In the end, he who had sought to live forever through the corruption of his soul found only oblivion, while those he had sought to destroy through fear and despair lived on to rebuild the world in the image of hope rather than terror. The wheel of fate had turned full circle, and the darkness that had seemed so permanent and overwhelming was revealed to be nothing more than the absence of light, an absence that could be dispelled by even the smallest flame if those who bore it had the courage to stand against the night. And that concludes this episode on the history of the Witch King. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive tonight. Until next time, stay safe and stay by the fire.